Can see? Okay, great. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to show will be you already would have a copy, which is the deck of slides which you can download. But what the objective is essentially for me to go through, okay, quickly, and then later on we will put aside some time, probably in half. Okay, depending on how fast I can go through and how many questions we have throughout the course, we can adjust the time that is allocated for the sharing of your so-called your exercise lah, huh? Okay, so let's quickly go through this first. Okay, so first is actually on recognizing. Okay, I forgot to give a background of myself. Okay, right. So I started doing BCP crisis management way back in 2003, and my starting is actually very interesting. It's quite different from a lot of people. I started from a manufacturing base, a semiconductor. That was in 2003. And right smack, if for those who can remember, it's actually right smack during SARS. So that was what I call an awakening for me, when you try to do business continuity in an environment of a new crisis or disaster scenario where it was one of a kind, in that time. Okay, but of course, from then until now, we have various what we call variations of a biological kind of a threat. Okay, so, and I was doing it for a manufacturing company way back at that time, right? All this BCP stuff, all this DRP stuff, all started with usually from the IT base. So it was quite, I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm saying, relatively speaking, when you're trying to do BCP for a brick and mortar, where the essential activities are done in actually a physical building, it's quite tough to do BCP or disaster recovery. But we managed to get through it because we had to, and we were being audited. So it was quite a challenge because we're trying to convince the certifiers as well as the consultants, etc., on how we have framed, how we frame the subject so that it is relevant for a manufacturing base. And if you all will know, right, manufacturing, there is actually no way you can do manufacturing of your primary facility because you're in semiconductor. Nobody replicates a semiconductor fab because it's so expensive. Okay, so that was my so-called my initiation into BCP, and of course, I went on from then to a conglomerate. We have multi-businesses, so I had operations in China, Malaysia, etc. So that was how my so-called my career in BCP started. Okay, right. So let's go into the subject material because I don't think we have time. It's already 2:30, and I hope to be able to complete by 5, so you can go back to whatever you are doing. Okay. So first up is lesson 7, which is recognizing crisis scenario. Okay. Why it's important to identify crisis, right? I think just now you heard Dr. Goh talked about the difference between crisis and business continuity. There is a natural overlap, and yet at the same time, it's quite different because usually if a disaster, right, which is essentially a disruption or denial of access to your primary facility, okay, and if you can imagine how bad your outage will be, typically you should be able to manage properly. But a crisis, right, the problem with the crisis is that it usually doesn't deny you from your access to your primary facility. But if a disaster is not managed properly, it can become a crisis in the sense that, let's say, for example, imagine that you have a fire scenario. You would think that, okay, given the list of threats and risks that my organization or the facility has, okay, I imagine a fire will probably not last more than 7 hours or 7 days or whatever. But let's say, for example, the severity of the fire was, how would I say, the severity exceeded your original expectations. Because for all you know, some of your fire prevention what you call measures did not work. So therefore, the fire, when it happened, it really escalated to a point beyond your planning boundaries. Then that will become a crisis. So you see, so while they can be distinct events, they can also be correlated. Okay, so that is why usually people do BCP and then they also will do crisis. If for a smaller outfit, they actually put together. But for very big outfits, right? Let's say the petroleum companies, or let's say global companies, right? They like to draw a distinction because sometimes it's managed by different people. But there is definitely a very close collaboration. You cannot have the BCP team and the crisis management team running independently. It'll be very funny. I've not actually seen one like that, but I mean, you never know how much we don't know, right? But in my experience, I've never seen them working so independently of each other. It's just that jurisdiction-wise, etc., and then maybe crisis management, you need to deal a lot with probably very senior level, so you need a certain kind of protocol, etc. Or you maybe need to inform authorities or maybe your shareholders. So it's more why they usually have a crisis management team independent of a BCP is because of protocol, politics, economics, maybe cross country jurisdiction, whatever. Okay, right. Okay, so crisis, we have a different types of crisis. Okay, then we need to categorize because again, depending on your internal workings, right? Different type of crisis may require activation of different people or notification to different bodies. So it's very unique to each company. Okay, and then you also need to develop what we call identification techniques. Okay, because your identification techniques will then allow you to categorize the crisis differently. Okay, then you need to identify potential crisis situations. Okay, and then typically you would have things like, okay, let's say you take for example an oil and gas company, right? What are the typical crises that can happen? Okay, environmental in nature. Let's say there's a gas leak. There is a petroleum leak like Deepwater Horizon (BP). Okay, it actually, if you look at BP, right, it actually, if they had been more vigilant and more responsive, right, to feedback that was given from the people working on the site, it probably would not have become a crisis, or actually at least not to that large scale, right? For those who have been reading, right, it started with a lot of leakages in the pipings, etc. So the workers on the ground were actually giving a lot of feedback, but it went unheard or when it was dismissed because if you would stop it and went to rectify, you take up a lot of time. So it didn't get addressed. Okay, and then because there was a lot of what I call people trying to hide the information. Okay, and then there was a lot of false information and incurred a lot of unhappiness from different stakeholders, the public, okay, the media, etc. So it became a big crisis that was, and where if you read the news now, okay, the BP stock price, which is very important for a lot of listed companies, it never recovered, and there was this overhang of this crisis, and then the CEO Tony something had to leave because there was so much bad publicity already. Okay, evaluate the risk associated with natural disasters, etc. So all this part and parcel of how you identify and categorize crisis. Okay, so that is a physical crisis. Another type of crisis would be what? Financial fraud, for example. That one will be a crisis because remember, in a financial fraud situation, you can assess your primary facility. But what is happening is a reputational crisis. Okay, so if you look at the whole, we have to compare with the BCP or BCM framework, it's actually under risk analysis and review, which Dr. Goh mentioned now. Okay, this is the BCP. Okay, now threats and crisis situations. Okay, there are different types of crises and they're different and associated with them, the different causes. So it's natural. Okay, for example, like your flood, bad weather, flood, let's say volcanic, what we call eruption, what else? Big winds, etc. Usually it's like that. Or let's say, for example, rising water, climatic change. Okay, so all this can contribute to natural disasters. Technological, for example, there is maybe for a cyber attack. Okay, technological nature, or your equipment fail. Confrontation, okay, for example, okay, these are more social issues, confrontation, okay, malevolence, meaning people actually acts of hostility, okay, organizational misdeeds, right, for example, like your financial fraud, okay, harassment, sexual harassment, okay, misconduct, okay, so all these are what we call organized, which are more human or human related, okay, workplace violence, okay, for example, if you're working in very cultures which are very volatile or violent, you will probably have a lot of workplace violence, okay, or maybe a lot of people passing back, false information, rumors, lack of funds, okay, natural factors. So all these are crisis types and causes that you will need to consider. But some of these crises that we have identified, while the types and causes is different, some of your responses might actually are quite the same. Okay, later on when we go through some of your exercises, we can actually discuss further. Okay, so this is what has been recommended. Okay, when you look at and try to analyze them, that is from the internal, external, then as another second tier called technical, economic, people, and social. Now, usually, okay, if it's internal driven or internally triggered, it'll probably be easier to manage, right? because you know what can happen. Therefore, you have the resources within your internal organization to actually handle. External is more challenging because the causes are external, and therefore there are more factors at play, and there is possibly then more challenging to try to rectify the the crisis. But having said that, right, they are actually interrelated in the sense that if you don't manage your internal affairs properly, okay, then it may cascade into an external impact. Similarly, external impact, okay, depending on where you are, it may also affect your internal operation. So while we try to have a distinction, usually we also, especially in our line of work, right, we cannot just look at it very independently. There is what we call a overlapping or interdependency that we must always consider. Okay, so as BC or crisis management practitioners, right, our role is actually to highlight things that, you know, internal staff don't know or are not aware or don't want to be aware. So a lot of times they always say us, you're like doomsay, what we call people who always think of bad things lah, you know, but it's the nature of our job, okay, that we need to actually put across that this can happen. And if it happened, what is our response? So usually in my practical sense is that I say my role is actually to highlight it. If all of us feel that it will not happen, then it's what I call a consensus that has been taken, but at least we did consider. Okay, so if it's a very significant issue, right, I also will put into a formal an email to the relevant senior leaders to say that, hey, this is what we've considered, but based on our discussion, we say that it is something either the cost of managing it is far bigger than the benefits, that therefore we don't even want to consider, or at least KIV, or we can say that the consensus is that we don't think it's something that is what we call of concern at this point of time. So just as a sidetrack thing is that if we are tasked to manage the BC and the crisis management program for the organization, it is very important to document it in a way that is not political. Just mention it as a fact, because a lot of time when things go wrong, right, we are usually the people to be blamed lah. You know, so it's just a practical observation, having been doing this for so long. Okay, so that is the typically how you want to categorize your crisis. Okay, now so this is essentially just another further elaboration, okay, of the previous chart, which is if you say technical, economic versus internal. External will be just economic and internal, technical, internal, etc. So if you try hard enough, you will be able to find so-called events or crises that fall into each category. But if you think even far deeper, each crisis, right, may in its extended or more in a deeper level may actually cross into other categories. So while it is good to have this exercise, do not be so what I call obsessed or engrossed in so-called identifying so strictly, because it doesn't do us any good. While we try to have some structure, we must also be open-minded enough to accept that things can actually evolve because of this butterfly effect, right? We always say something happens, it just cannot be considered in isolation. We must think, you know, if this happens and if things get a bit worse and a bit worse and a bit worse, what can happen? You know, of course, how far into you want to go into this exercise of imagination, then it really depends on how much latitude or your organization or your senior management wants you to consider, right? Okay, so that is how it is. Like just like COVID, right? Who would have thought it became a global issue? I mean, frankly speaking, even me, okay, who have gone through SARS, who have gone through bird flu, I never thought that COVID would have come to this stage. Okay, and then as a side thing, right? If you ask me, what actually has the best kind of resiliency plan, and I would tell you, it's viruses. They are so adaptable, they're so resilient, they keep mutating. You know, it's almost like, pardon me for saying so, is that and not trying to be religious or disrespectful to religion. It's almost nature's way of saying that it's a form of population control. You know, then it's like, oh, okay, this person is sick. You know, I think you know, maybe it's time for him or her to go. That kind of a thing, you know. So I apologize if I offend anybody, but that's my thinking. Is that it's just this nature's way of, you know, of managing certain things, you know. And then And viruses, to me, I tell you, they are the most resilient form of being, which, what is resiliency? It's actually a continuation, right? So continuation of their existence, lah. Viruses are that kind of what I call a being. Okay, yeah. So this is further example. So for example, if we talk about what is this? Let's say, for example, you look at technical issues, yeah. For example, if there's a breach, okay, it's an internal issue. You talk about a financial crisis, political crisis, utility structure. Okay, this is probably economic in nature from an external angle, because we've been reading so much, right? All these things about this, the Fed printing, etc., right? So there's free liquidity, a lot of money. It encourages certain kind of behavior. People over leverage. So when you over leverage, okay, and suddenly when the businesses fails, you are not able to service your loans, etc., that's when you will have a financial crisis. Okay, processing failures. Okay, then the other one will be your terrorism, sabotage, civil unrest. All this, some examples, okay, of the different type of crisis falling into the different categorization. Okay, now how do you manage the risk, right? First and foremost, right from the bottom, right? It starts from the bottom. You need to be able to identify, okay, because if you don't identify, you don't know what you're going to fix. Then you assess, what is the likelihood of occurrence? What is the impact? So you will follow what we call a likelihood impact table to find out the risk level, okay? And the risk level will then determine whether you put in extra efforts to manage it to an acceptable level. Okay, so what kind of risk statement you can actually avoid it? Okay, you can transfer by way. Okay, now transfer, people will always refer to insurance. Okay, insurance to me is only what we call managing the financial implications, but your accountability still remains with the organization. So what do I mean by this? Okay, let's say you buy insurance for certain things. Yeah, over time, after the loss adjusters come, they assess the damage, they will pay you, right? But that will take a long time. But ultimately, they will pay you what they are obligated to pay. But during that time, right, when there's already a disruption, do you think your customers, are you still able to produce? Are you still able to make your customers happy? Maybe all it takes is just one event or one disaster to really cause a downfall, because your critical customers, your most important customer, might feel so discouraged and have lose confidence in you and say, sorry, we are not going to buy from you anymore. And that's the end of your company. So these are very important things that we need to consider. Okay. Another one is respond, which is then, can your company survive? Okay. A lot of times when you're doing this, managing this crisis, trying to put up a BCP or crisis a program to your senior management, right? There is a tendency, I'm not saying all, but there's a tendency for senior manage to feel this, sorry lah, I say, yeah, I know, but this kind of thing will not happen to me one. It will happen to everybody else, right? Not me lah. There's this tendency, okay, because it's very natural, because it's just like and also people will say that, why spend so much money on BC crisis? I'd rather take the money to do a marketing plan, for example. Because BC crisis management or business continuity is very hard to measure the returns on investments. Okay, so that is, you cannot quantify what we call, it's hard to quantify in terms of dollars and cents. A lot of times it's actually reputational in nature. Okay, so that is why the challenge is for our people in this industry. Okay, so we go on into this, how to quantify, yeah? It's identify the threats, okay? Trying to then ask ourselves, okay, what is the likelihood of this threat materializing? And if it were to materialize, what is the impact, okay, on this particular threat? And then you actually come up with a risk rating. So depending on how high or how low, you decide whether you want to treat it or you want to accept it, okay? Okay, then risk likelihood, the state of being probable or chance of it happening. Risk impact is then the consequence of something if it were to happen. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, so this is an example. Okay, when you look at risk likelihood, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you want to put 10 also can, but whether, the question is it practical? Is it even meaningful? I can have even 100 levels, but what does it do? Okay, so usually people will go with the 5 by 5, because 5 by 5 is also the MOM current recommendation for risk assessment. Okay, so you can go from very low to very high. Then you talk about high, then you describe it. What is it, how highly unlikely? Okay, maybe once in 10 years. Then on the flip side is that if it's very high, that means it's very likely to occur. Okay, once in how many years, etc., etc. Now, it's important to describe or give some elaboration of what it means, because if you don't, then very low and very high means different things for different people. For an organization who has been exposed to a lot of risk, right? Okay, what is considered very risky for a small organization is actually nothing, no big deal to a big organization. So it's very important to actually elaborate what it means. Okay, now another thing is this is also this thing about a lot of people say this is a 100-year flood. So it doesn't mean that just because in the last 100 years, one flood already happened, it doesn't mean that the year after that, and the 101 year, there will be no flood. It's just essentially what it's trying to say is a very rare event. Okay, so be careful about being so caught up in numbers. You know, statistics as useful to the scenario, but you cannot be so hung up to the point that it makes you so what we call rigid into looking at it from the numbers point that you forget the reality or the practical aspect of it. Okay, now this one is actually the impact. Okay, again, it's from 1 to 5. Okay, ranging from very low to very high. So unlike probability, right, when we talk about impact, it takes on a different dimension in the sense that it can take on different what we call attributes. With financial, okay, could be people. So financial, again, could say, let's say very low is less than 10 million. Okay, very high is about 250 million. And then if you talk about people, you see very low usually means, okay, minor safety incident, maybe just no injury or just first aid. Now on the other end, could be fatality. Okay, so it's important. Okay, people part usually there's no issue lah, huh? Because we all know that human lives are actually very important. Okay, and then of course you have your IT systems, etc. Now financial is the one that can be challenging to actually quantify. So usually what I do is that if I want to quantify, I want to change the numbers, I will work typically with the CFO, okay, to find something that is reasonable and not too what I call risk averse or too risk what we call risk might become a big risk appetite. So for example, you might want to consider your insurance policy. Okay, your very low could mean your deductible level, right? So for example, you might say that, okay, in your insurance policy, typically people would have a deductible level, meaning to say anything below that level, okay, the organization will accept. So that could mean your very low level or medium. Okay, then your very high could mean something like, for example, your revenue for the particular month, example. Okay, or how many days of loss of operation, etc. So all these numbers you can propose something, but do not propose until you have had a talk with the relevant people, maybe your CFO, your CEO, etc., to come up with numbers which is reasonable, and then you can test case. Okay, because if you set it too low, every single thing become high, then you have a problem because you'll be very busy. If you set it too low, set it too high, then nothing is ever a financial risk. Also wrong. Okay, it doesn't make sense. So usually, okay, most people when they look at this, right, they form into what I call a normal table, okay, a normal distribution. Okay, so later I will elaborate what is normal distribution and how typically people will look at it. Okay, so this is the final outcome of how you do risk likelihood impact become your risk table. Now, you'll notice that it is very symmetrical, right? Anything 5, it's green, then orange, red, and then very red right now. That means there are actually 25 levels and there are 5 risk ratings, okay, from very low risk to very high risk. Okay, now very important is that you can put even 10 levels if you want to, but what is the practical aspect of it? Unless every risk level carries with it different types of responses, then otherwise it's meaningless. Okay, you all get what I'm trying to say. So maybe you say, okay, if it's green means fine, acceptable, I don't have to do anything about it. Okay, yellow, then I need to go to must put find control measures. Orange means highlight to certain level. Red must highlight to broad. So unless you can actually prescribe or require certain kind of responses for each risk category, otherwise don't do it because it doesn't add a lot of meaning. It just makes the chart very colorful. Okay, but it's very tough for you to then you become very anal or very hung up again on quantifying things. Okay, and then that's one observation. Another observation is that when you look at this, it's very symmetrical, right? Meaning you say, okay, it's like when it's 5, it means yellow, green. If it's like anything less than 10, it's yellow. Okay, so you will notice that in some risk assessments, right, it is not symmetrical. Meaning to say that some people might even call this likelihood is very rare and low, but the impact is 5. They might call this particular 5 as a red or even an orange. So it's not symmetrical. The reason is that, okay, because the principle behind is that even though it's a low risk event, if the impact is very high, they want to manage it. So it's like saying, okay, let's say an earthquake. Earthquake, the likelihood of it happening usually is not very high, right? Depending on where you locate your plant. But if it happens, it can be very serious, right? Now, so it becomes, even though it's high in low probability, low likelihood, but very high risk impact, it can even right at this particular point here, right? It can become red. So companies might say, okay, if it's an earthquake incident, okay, I need to buy business interruption insurance, for example. Okay, so it again, which is right, which is better, again, is a function of your organization's risk appetite. Okay, so that is why I always re-emphasize or encourage you as a risk manager, you will start with something, but do not take it as the gospel truth until you actually clarify and engage with the necessary senior level people to go through this iterative process so that we all agree on what is low, what is high, what is medium, etc. It's very important, because if you don't do it properly, or at least there's some kind of agreement, what may happen is that nothing's get alerted to them. Then they feel very uncomfortable. Or if you become too risk adverse, everything's get alerted to them. You become also very busy. So there must be a balance. And that balance is achieved through a lot of engagement with your relevant stakeholders. Okay, risk rating, right? Okay, it's the two combined together. It's a multiplication effect. Right. Okay, so I back to this one. So essentially what this shows is the different types of threats. And after analysis, okay, you have the likelihood and the impact. And this is where it fits into the heat map. So there are two ways of looking at managing of your crisis or your threats. So for example, one of the things that you can consider is a fire scenario, right? Okay, typically when you do business continuity, you would be able to reduce the impact. Okay, reduce the impact from the business interruption angle, meaning the fire will still happen. Okay, and you do all you can to reduce the likelihood of it. Fire, what we call reduction, and the reducing the impact and the likelihood. Okay, that will bring it down into the reducing the likelihood. But if you really want to, the whole idea of doing business continuity is to make sure that if the fire were to happen, okay, what other things you can do to make sure it doesn't affect your business? That is business continuity. Okay, not just purely reducing the likelihood of the fire happening or the impact of the fire happening. That one you still do. It's just like your workplace safety and health personnel. They will reduce the impact of the fire by, let's say, putting detectors, having fire extinguishers. All this will manage the effects of the fire. But if say that the fire were to happen, if it's not well controlled, right, there will be an eventuality that affects your critical business function, which is the activities that you need to do to make sure that you can continue to do your business. And that is part of the business continuity in that stricter sense. So maybe you say, oh, okay, I need to find an external facility. I need to engage other consultants to use their facility, etc., etc. Okay, so that is that difference. Okay, so typically what would happen is that, okay, this is an example of what you can do. Okay, so in the highest level, right, let's say it's a very high risk, right, you want to avoid. So let's say, for example, right, if the consideration was to decide whether I would want to put my business in a war-torn countries or highly volatile countries, if you can, you would probably, the right thing to do is to avoid it. So then once you avoid it, that risk no longer exists. Okay, or you can reduce and implement control to continue to bring it down to a green level. Okay, then accept is when it is already in the green level, meaning to say that the risk has been assessed to be within the acceptable range, and therefore technically speaking you don't have to reduce any further, unless to reduce it further requires no more resources, right? With this concept called ALAP, which is as low as reasonably possible. Okay, and to the point that your cost does not outweigh the benefit. Okay, and then another thing you can consider transfer, which typically means buying insurance. Now remember, as I said again, right, transferring via insurance just probably will just help to mitigate your financial loss, but it doesn't really outsource, or rather remove your obligations and your accountability as a business, you are still accountable to your vendors or your customers who buy things from you, and there's a certain expectation that you deliver your product or the service that you have to they buy from you. Okay, so there's a slight difference. So remember, okay. Okay, learning activity. Okay, maybe it's time now to wait, I've got how many more slides? 21 slides. So why don't I do this? Why don't we complete this deck and then we can discuss your exercise? Okay, so look at risk assessment of process. It's a bit like we did this before just now. Yeah, okay. So you have your threat. Okay, threat. What does threat means, right? What are the adverse events that can occur? Whether it's a flood, whether it's a what I call an overturned truck, etc., or flood, fire, etc. All this can be a threat. And then you ask yourself, then you have your what we call your then you ask yourself, okay, if you don't do anything to it, okay, given the impact that can happen, okay, what is the risk level? Then you ask yourself, okay, what are the things that you can put in place to reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact? Okay, then after that you can then reassess your risk impact again. You get understand what I'm trying to say, right? Okay, so I will quickly go through because I don't have time. Okay, okay, later we'll go to your exercise, which is identifying your threats, estimate the likelihood and your impact, and then your risk rating, and then develop risk treatment table. Okay, just to share my experience. Some companies like to do inherent risk. I think the banks, you like to say, in the absence of risk treatment, what is your risk rating? Then after you put your controls, what is the risk rating? Right? Okay, I think to me is that it's a matter of preferences. Okay, because I in the banks, I suppose maybe the authorities or regulators require it, but if you're not regulated to that level, then I personally don't think it's a big deal, because in the absence of any controls, the risk will naturally be high, right? Right, that's how I look at it lah. So usually when I do for my companies, I usually put already considered risk treatment already in place. Then I will have a final risk rating. Okay, so again, it's very personal and unique to the respective organizations. Okay, now shall we is it a good time now? Actually, at this one I already discussed this. Okay, so essentially what we have discussed is really how to identify your threats, how to go about, okay, putting some form and structure into quantifying your risk or your threats, which is essentially your likelihood and your impact. Okay, then ask ourselves, what is the controls that you can put in place? Okay, and what is the final risk rating and whether it meets your acceptable level or not.